Well, folks, buckle up because the COVID blame game just took a turn for the hold my Tsing-Tao weird. China, after years of basically saying, nope, not us, is suddenly pointing the finger at America. That's right, they're now suggesting COVID-19 actually started in the good old US of A. Now, before you spit out your Bud Light in patriotic outrage, let's be clear. This isn't some random dude on Weibo. This is China's government laying out a whole conspiracy theory in a fancy white paper. And it's got everything: shadowy timelines, accusations of cover-ups, even a sprinkle of Fort Detrick for good measure. But why now? Why, after years of deflecting blame, is China suddenly going full-blown America started it? And more importantly, is there even a shred of evidence to back up this claim? Let's dive into the murky, virus-laden waters of international pandemic politics, shall we? To really get a grip on how China is trying to reshape the story today, we need to hit rewind and revisit those almost surreal pre-pandemic days of 2020. Picture it. Crowded city streets, no one wearing masks, life buzzing along as usual in places like Wuhan. The world had no idea what was about to hit. It was a time before lockdowns, before social distancing, before the word coronavirus was on everyone's lips. Then, everything changed. Suddenly, then President Trump was on TV, repeatedly calling COVID-19 the China virus and even the Kung flu. Remember those press conferences? The world watched as he doubled down on the rhetoric, sparking outrage and debate. It wasn't exactly the most diplomatic approach, and it definitely didn't help international relations. But it did set the tone for how the pandemic would be politicized, both in the US and around the globe. But Trump's language was just the tip of the iceberg. His administration, leaning on some intelligence reports, though let's be honest, those reports were about as clear as a mud puddle, started pushing a much bigger idea that the virus didn't just come from China, but might have actually leaked from a lab in Wuhan. Suddenly, the world's attention shifted from wet markets to the mysterious Wuhan Institute of Virology, where scientists were known to study bat coronaviruses. The CIA and FBI got involved, launching investigations that played out like a real-life episode of CSI. Except this time, the stakes were global, and the evidence was murky at best. News outlets ran with the lab leak theory, fueling speculation and conspiracy theories. The world was suddenly obsessed with the idea of a virus escaping from a high-security lab, and the narrative took on a life of its own. At first, most experts and officials dismissed the lab leak theory as a politically motivated distraction, something cooked up to shift blame. But as time went on, the theory gained traction. After all, Wuhan was ground zero for the outbreak, and the virology lab there really was researching bat coronaviruses. Was it all just a wild coincidence? Or was this the opening chapter of a global pandemic conspiracy thriller? The world was left to wonder, and the debate was just getting started. Fast forward to today, and China's had enough. Their white paper is basically a giant, "Oh yeah, well you started it." To the US government, they're accusing the US of hiding early COVID-19 cases, pointing to unexplained respiratory illnesses in late 2019. They're also bringing up Fort Detrick, a US military base with a history of, shall we say, unfortunate incidents involving dangerous pathogens. And their evidence? Well, it's a mixed bag. They cite things like online articles, social media posts, and even some scientific studies, often taken out of context, it must be said. China's argument boils down to this: the US was being shady, there were weird outbreaks they never explained, and oh, by the way, Fort Detrick is basically the American Wuhan Institute of Virology. Convincing? Not really. But it does highlight the lack of transparency and the politically charged atmosphere surrounding the whole origin question. Now, while the politicians are busy playing the blame game, pointing fingers and making headlines, the real search for answers is happening far away from the spotlight of government chambers. So, what do the actual scientists say when it comes to the origins of COVID-19? What does the evidence really point to, according to those who spend their lives studying viruses? Well, the most widely accepted theory among the scientific community is still that COVID-19 jumped from animals to humans, rather than being engineered or escaping from a lab. This process is known as zoonotic spillover, where a virus crosses over from animals to people, sometimes with devastating consequences. And this isn't just some wild guess or a convenient explanation, it's based on decades of research and patterns we've seen before. We've seen it before with viruses like SARS in 2003 and Ebola outbreaks in Africa, both of which also started in animals before infecting humans. China, in particular, is a massive hub for the wildlife trade, with bustling markets where many different species are kept in close quarters. In these environments, animals are often stacked in cages handled by workers and sometimes even sold for food or traditional medicine, creating the perfect storm for viruses to jump between species. So when you think about it, it's really not all that surprising that a new virus could emerge from such a setting. The conditions are ripe for something to go wrong. Most virologists and epidemiologists believe that the most likely scenario is that the virus originated in bats, which are known to carry a wide variety of coronaviruses. From there, it may have jumped to an intermediary animal, possibly pangolins, those scaly anteaters that are sadly trafficked for their unique scales and meat. The illegal wildlife trade brings these animals into close contact with humans, increasing the risk of disease transmission. Eventually, the virus made its way from animals to humans, setting off the global pandemic we all know too well. But here's the thing, pinpointing the exact animal origin is incredibly challenging. It's like searching for a needle in a haystack with many dead ends and false leads. For example, it took years of painstaking investigation to finally identify the animal source of SARS, and even then, there were still lingering questions. And when it comes to Ebola, scientists are still searching for definitive answers about its original host, despite decades of research. So while the zoonotic theory remains the most likely explanation for how COVID-19 began, the scientific community is still searching for that final, undeniable piece of evidence. In other words, we're still missing that smoking bat, so to speak. A clear, direct link that would solve the mystery once and for all. Okay, let's address the elephant, or maybe bat, in the room. When it comes to the origins of COVID-19, there's been a whirlwind of speculation, rumors, and heated debates. It's easy to get lost in the noise, but let's break it down and look at what we actually know, and what we don't. One of the most talked about ideas is the so-called lab leak theory. But here's the thing, there are actually two very different versions of this theory, and it's important to separate them. The first is the accidental leak scenario. This version suggests that scientists at the Wuhan Institute of Virology were studying coronaviruses, possibly even the one that became COVID-19. And through some kind of accident, maybe a breach in safety protocols, a contaminated surface, or a simple human error, the virus managed to escape the lab and make its way into the population. The second version is much more dramatic and frankly veers into conspiracy territory. This is the engineered virus theory. According to this idea, the virus wasn't just being studied, it was deliberately created or modified in a lab, possibly as a bioweapon, and then released on purpose or by design. Or, at the very least, that it was intentionally let loose for some nefarious reason. But here's the reality check. There's no credible evidence to support the engineered virus theory. None. This idea has been thoroughly investigated and debunked by virtually every reputable scientist and international health organization that's looked into it. The genetic makeup of the virus doesn't show signs of deliberate engineering. The accidental leak theory, on the other hand, is a bit more complicated. It hasn't been ruled out entirely, but it's still considered less likely than the natural origin theory. Most experts believe the virus likely jumped from animals to humans, possibly at a wet market in Wuhan, which is how many outbreaks begin. The main evidence for the lab leak theory is circumstantial. Things like the proximity of the lab to the outbreak, the fact that the lab was studying bat coronaviruses, and some unverified reports of lab workers getting sick in late 2019. These points raise questions, but they don't provide concrete answers. There's no smoking gun, just a collection of coincidences and possibilities. The fact that the lab was researching bat coronaviruses is interesting but not unusual. Many labs around the world study dangerous pathogens to better understand and prevent outbreaks. And those reports of sick lab workers? They remain unverified with no clear evidence linking them to the first cases of COVID-19. Now let's talk about China's counterclaims, specifically the allegations about Fort Detrick in the United States. These claims are even more tenuous, lacking any substantial evidence or credible support from the international scientific community. While it's true that Fort Detrick has had safety issues in the past, there's absolutely no evidence connecting it to the COVID-19 outbreak. In short, while questions remain, the most extraordinary claims simply don't hold up under scrutiny. The search for the true origin continues, but for now, the wildest theories are just that, wild. One of the most frustrating things about this whole debate is the lack of transparency from both sides. China, for its part, has been incredibly reluctant to allow independent investigations into the origins of the virus. They've delayed sharing data, restricted access to researchers, and generally acted more interested in controlling the narrative than getting to the bottom of what happened. But the US hasn't exactly been a shining beacon of openness either. Remember those intelligence reports about the lab leak? Yeah, turns out they were based on pretty flimsy evidence and a whole lot of assumptions. Both sides accuse the other of politicizing the issue and hindering investigations. And honestly, they're both right. The constant back and forth, the accusations, the lack of transparency, it's all incredibly damaging to global trust and cooperation. We need countries to work together to prevent and respond to pandemics. But that's pretty hard to do when everyone's pointing fingers and shouting, "You started it." This isn't just about COVID-19 anymore. It's about setting a dangerous precedent for future outbreaks. If we can't even agree on how this pandemic started, how are we supposed to work together to prevent the next one? The blame game is a dangerous distraction. It's time to move beyond the politics and focus on what really matters. Understanding the virus, preventing future pandemics, and, not destroying what's left of global cooperation. So, after all that, where do we stand? What do we actually know about the origins of COVID-19? Well, here's the honest and maybe unsatisfying truth. The most likely scenario is still zoonotic spillover. The virus probably jumped from animals to humans, likely involving an intermediary species. The lab leak theory, while less likely, can't be completely ruled out. There's just not enough evidence to say for sure either way. Both China and the US have been less than transparent, hindering investigations and fueling mistrust. In other words, we still don't know for sure how this whole mess started. And we may never have a definitive answer. You might be thinking, okay, so we don't know for sure where it came from. Big deal, right? Wrong. Understanding the origins of pandemics isn't just about assigning blame, although some people seem to think so. It's about preventing the next one. If we know how a virus jumped from animals to humans, we can put measures in place to prevent it from happening again. We can monitor wildlife populations, regulate the wildlife trade, and develop early warning systems. But if we're too busy playing the blame game, too busy pointing fingers and spreading misinformation, we're never going to learn the lessons we need to. And that, folks, is a recipe for disaster, because the next pandemic, it's not a